There are places in the galaxy where even the bravest souls of the Imperium refuse to let their thoughts linger. Cold vaults carved from living metal, hidden beneath worlds long stripped of life, where time does not flow as mortals understand it. In these hollow catacombs, silence reigns with a weight more crushing than any planetary gravity. The air, if it can be called that, thrums with a faint static whisper, as though reality itself is being rewritten by unseen hands. Here, in these labyrinths built for purposes no human mind was shaped to grasp, the Necrons imprison those unfortunate enough to be taken alive. Few realize such places exist. Even fewer return with their sanity intact. To speak of a Necron prison is to speak of a realm without mercy, without sound, without the fragile warmth of mortal presence. It is a place where the passage of days becomes meaningless, and the boundaries of flesh, memory, and identity blur in the grip of cold technologies older than human civilization. It is a sentence not of confinement, but of unmaking, delivered by beings who have abandoned all life except the ghost of their will. Before we descend into that darkness, before we follow the thread of a captive soul into the heart of a tomb world's hidden machinery, take a moment to lend your strength to this chronicle. Your voice, your presence, your support allow stories like this to surface from the depths of the 41st millennium. Like, share, and subscribe if you wish to walk further with us into the haunted places of the galaxy. The first thing I remember is the sound. Thin, sharp, and impossibly distant, like metal screaming through the vacuum between stars, carving its way through the battlefield haze just before the world folded in on itself. One moment I was stumbling across the shattered ridge with my laser gun trembling in my grip, the sky above me choked with the smoke of burning promethium and the fractured silhouettes of falling Valkyries, and the next, the air grew cold enough to bite into my teeth as the shadows around me stretched in unnatural directions. I had heard stories of Necron emergence, how reality seemed to stutter, how time became sluggish, how every instinct screamed that the world itself was being rewritten by something older than the Imperium. But hearing a legend is one thing, living it is another. The ridge, the bodies, the dust, everything shivered as green energy crackled outward in a perfect geometric bloom, freezing me where I stood. For a heartbeat I believed I had been killed, that this was some strange final moment where all senses bled into one. But death would have been merciful. Instead, I found myself still conscious, trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed me. My limbs locked in place, my fingers rigidly curled around my weapon as invisible pressure pinned me upright. The Necron that stepped from the distortion moved with a silence so complete it felt like a pressure wave against my skull, its metal body reflecting the sickly emerald glow spilling from the runes along its staff. I had seen pick captures during briefing cycles, but none had captured the awful precision of the creature, the way it regarded me not as an enemy but as a malfunctioning object to be catalogued. When its gaze fell upon me, twin orbs of baleful green burning inside its skull-like helm, my breath jammed somewhere deep in my throat. I tried to scream, to beg, to pray, but the paralysis that held me made every sound stay trapped behind my clenched teeth. Around me, the battlefield continued to die. My squad mates lay strewn across the dirt, some still twitching with the last remnants of life, others simply gone, reduced to drifting ash by Goss fire. I could see Sergeant Callan's hand reaching toward me, fingers curled in a final plea, his armor half melted, the aquila on his breastplate sagging like wax near flame. And yet, even as grief tore through me, I could not move to him. I could not close his eyes. I could not do anything except watch as the Necron Lord, its hieroglyphic sigils shimmering like fading starlight, raised its staff and traced symbols into the air. Lines of emerald light wrapped around my body, threading through armor and skin with precise indifference, tightening until I felt as though my bones were being measured from the inside. Then the ground beneath me dissolved. It wasn't teleportation the way the Adeptus Astartes describe it. No blinding flash, no disorienting rupture. It felt instead as though gravity had been turned sideways, pulling me through a thin membrane of reality. I didn't fall. I was pulled, dragged through a pinprick of cold that expanded until it swallowed every thought and sensation I had, stretching my mind like a strand of nerve fiber across an impossible distance. When sensation returned, it came in fragments. The air tasted stale and metallic, the kind of stale that suggested it wasn't meant for lungs at all. The chamber was dim, illuminated by faint emerald light seeping from cracks in the angular walls. Each surface seemed to ripple faintly, as though the metal was alive and breathing. I was suspended in midair, held upright by tendrils of luminous force that wrapped around my limbs and spine, gently tightening whenever I tried to move. Panic rose sharp and acidic in my throat. But I could not thrash, could not twist. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, the only sound in a place devoid of anything resembling life. Then I saw the other shapes. Human forms, some fresh, some long dead, embedded in the floor or suspended in similar energy bindings. Their bodies contorted in positions suggesting their final moments were spent in mute horror. A chill rippled across my skin as I realized none of them had been restrained physically. Whatever held them was the same force that held me, a perfect, calculated imprisonment that required no bars, no chains. Something shifted in the shadows. A smaller construct glided forward, its body slender and ornamented with delicate filigree that seemed to hum with intelligence. A cryptek. I had heard officers whisper of them, of their mastery over sciences the Mechanicus could only dream of how they could peel apart a mind the way a scribe peels parchment. It circled me slowly, each step silent, each movement accompanied by a faint ripple in the air that made my vision flicker with ghostly afterimages. When it leaned closer, the lenses on its faceplate adjusting with a faint click, I felt something probe the edges of my thoughts. Not words, not malice. A cold, analytical curiosity, as though the entity was sifting through the surface of my consciousness, cataloging memories it found relevant and discarding others like debris. I tried again to fight, to jerk away, to resist, but the energy bindings merely tightened, sending a jolt of numbing cold through my limbs. The cryptek paused, its head tilting in a gesture disturbingly close to fascination. Then it reached out with a spindly metal hand, tapped a series of runes along a floating hologlyph, and the chamber shifted around me. Corridors unfolded where solid walls had been a heartbeat earlier, geometric patterns reconfiguring themselves with serpentine fluidity. I realized with growing dread that the structure itself was alive with purpose, that the prison was not merely a place, but a device. I was not being kept here. I was being processed. Somewhere deep within the shifting catacombs, an ancient hum rose, vibrating through the floor, through my spine, through the deepest part of my mind. It felt like a countdown, or a summoning, or the first breath of something older than humanity awakening to acknowledge my existence. And in that cold moment, suspended between life and whatever fate Necrons reserved for the living, I understood a terrible truth. Death had never been the worst thing that could happen on a battlefield. This was. The descent began without warning, a sudden lurch in the luminous restraints that held me, as if invisible claws had tightened their grip and dragged me sideways through a corridor I could neither see nor comprehend. At first I thought the chamber itself was collapsing, its walls folding inward like the petals of a dying metal flower. But then the patterns shifted again, and I realized it wasn't collapsing. It was reconfiguring with deliberate precision, opening a path meant solely for me. The Necrons didn't need doors. They didn't need hallways. Their structures moved around them like obedient machinery responding to an unspoken command. The cryptek drifted ahead, its body leaving faint trails of light that coiled briefly in the air before fading, as though the chamber were erasing its own memory of the creature's passage. I felt myself slide after it, suspended in the same immobilizing field, and the sensation was like being carried through a current of cold air that changed direction every few seconds without warning. The deeper we traveled, the more the atmosphere shifted. The faint metallic tang thickened into a dense ionized taste, prickling against my tongue as though I were breathing through a stagnant electrical storm. There were no footsteps, no whirring servos, no hum of machinery beyond the omnipresent vibration coursing through the walls, the same low-frequency resonance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some ancient mechanism buried far below. Every so often, a faint green shimmer rippled through the structure, casting the angular metal surfaces into ghostly relief. I caught glimpses of other chambers, some empty, some holding strange arcane devices resembling suspended geometries of living metal, and others occupied by creatures whose silhouettes were mercifully obscured by distance and shifting walls. At one point, the binding field twisted me slightly to the right, just enough for me to see into a cavernous vault where dozens of human bodies hovered in perfect rows, each wrapped in stasis fields identical to mine. Some were from the Astra Militarum, their flak armor half intact, some bore the sealed helmets of voidfarers, and some were in civilian garments, faces frozen in expressions of terror or numb resignation. None moved. I could not tell which were alive and which were preserved beyond life, held for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. The cryptek paused at the threshold of that vault, its head tilting, lenses cycling through spectrums of light that made my vision warp. Somewhere in that moment I felt it watching me. Not physically, but through some psychic or technological sense that brushed my thoughts like an inquisitive finger. It did not speak, yet something about its posture conveyed a judgment, as though my presence here fit into a calculation it had already anticipated. When it resumed its glide, the path sealed behind us with absolute soundlessness, erasing the vault as though it had never existed. The descent continued, growing stranger with each shift. The walls took on new shapes, smooth, then jagged, then honeycombed with intricate circuitry that pulsed in slow waves like a heartbeat too vast to belong to any creature. Occasionally, patterns of alien glyphs flickered along the passages, casting brief reflections on my armor. Their meanings were unknowable, but I could sense intent behind them, like the focused gaze of a predator just out of sight. Worse were the moments when the corridors bent at angles that made my stomach churn. It felt like the very geometry of the place was wrong, not merely unfamiliar, but actively hostile to human perception. Distances stretched unnaturally. Sometimes a single corridor seemed to go on for minutes, the end always appearing one breath too far away. Other times, a passageway ended almost immediately after opening, forcing sharp, nauseating turns that made my senses rebel. The cryptek navigated effortlessly, as though the labyrinth shifted in anticipation of its steps. I had no such certainty. My mind kept slipping, thoughts fraying at the edges, as if the structure were quietly, methodically unraveling the parts of my consciousness that insisted upon familiar physics. The deeper we went, the more it felt as though the tomb were studying me, not with eyes or mechanical instruments, but with a presence suffusing the walls themselves. The hum intensified, rising just enough in pitch to make the air vibrate against my eardrums. Each pulse seemed to reach directly into my chest, resonating with my heartbeat in a way that was deeply wrong, as though the tomb wanted to synchronize with the rhythm of my life. When I tried to focus on anything, on memories, prayers, names, the thoughts drifted like dust motes in a shifting breeze. Only fear remained sharp, anchored deep in my skull like a nail. Eventually, the passage narrowed, funneling into a vertical shaft so vast I could not see the top or bottom. Columns of light crisscrossed the void, forming a lattice of green illumination that flickered in strange patterns. The cryptek floated onto one of the columns, and without hesitation, the force field carrying me followed, guiding me along the beam like a weightless puppet. As we descended deeper into the shaft, I saw shapes moving far below, massive constructs resembling floating obelisks, rotating slowly in perfect synchronization. Their surfaces were adorned with shifting runes, each symbol dissolving into another in a hypnotic cascade. The energy radiating from them felt ancient, oppressive, as though I were drifting through the lungs of something that had been asleep for millions of years. Time lost meaning. I don't know how long we traveled, seconds, hours, or entire days. The only markers were the faint tremors that echoed through the shaft, subtle quakes that made the runes flicker like dying stars. With each tremor, my restraints pulsed, adjusting their grip on my body. At some point, my fear dulled into numb exhaustion, though the force field kept my body rigid, never allowing me to sag or rest. When the descent finally ended, it did so with a sudden cessation of movement so abrupt that it felt as though the universe had blinked. The shaft opened into a circular chamber far larger than any before it, its center dominated by an enormous device resembling a fractured sphere held together by streams of green lightning. The cryptek hovered toward a small platform at the sphere's base, manipulating a cluster of floating glyphs with rapid precision. Energy surged around the sphere in liquid arcs, casting shifting shadows that stretched across the walls like reaching hands. The force field eased me forward until I hovered at the edge of the sphere's glow. Heat and cold rolled off it in alternating waves, each pulse burrowing into my skull with a sensation that made my vision dissolve into static. I tried again to cry out, to plead, to curse, but my body refused every command. The cryptek turned its head toward me, lenses narrowing slightly. That small gesture, almost human in its deliberation, terrified me more than anything else in the descent. For the first time, I realized with absolute clarity that I was not merely being imprisoned. I was being delivered. And whatever waited within that fractured sphere was something the Necrons believed could use me. The field tightened around my chest. My breath hitched, the glyphs brightened. And the last sensation before the sphere's energy reached out to claim me was the unmistakable feeling of being measured, weighed, and accepted. The moment the sphere's energy touched me, the world dissolved into a dull, suffocating haze where sound, light, and thought bled together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. There was no impact, no searing pain, no dramatic shattering of perception, only a slow, creeping numbness that spread through my nerves like cold sap rising through dead roots. For a heartbeat, I thought I had ceased to exist, that the sphere had simply erased me with the same indifferent precision Necron Gauss weapons used to flense the flesh from bone. But then a faint vibration returned to my senses, a tremor that felt like my own heartbeat but out of rhythm, as if something else were pulsing inside me, overriding my natural cadence. Vision seeped back in blurred gradients of green and silver until the world resolved into a chamber unlike any I had seen before. A place shaped not by hands or tools, but by pure intention, as if the metal walls had flowed into being in response to a thought older than humanity. I was suspended in the center of the chamber, but the restraints that had held me until now were gone. Instead, a soft radiance wrapped around my limbs, not binding me physically, but preventing movement through a pressure I could not resist. The air tasted stale, metallic, charged with static that made every breath burn faintly in my throat. There were no doors, no visible exits, nothing resembling a mechanism or access point. The chamber felt hermetically sealed, as though it had not been opened since an age when Terra itself was young. Time did not behave normally here. Shadows clung to the walls in ways that contradicted the position of the light, drifting slowly as though cast by unseen figures walking just out of sight. The ground beneath me was a single seamless sheet of necrodermis, its surface rippling faintly like the skin of a creature dreaming. Occasionally, the ripples synchronized with the strange double beat in my chest, and each time they did, a faint whisper crawled across the edge of my hearing. It wasn't speech, not exactly, but more like the afterimage of a voice translated into sensation. At first, I thought the whispers were hallucinations, the product of exhaustion and trauma, but then the patterns on the walls shifted, aligning into a lattice of glyphs that pulsed with faint illumination. It was then that I sensed it, a watchfulness, vast and impersonal, probing my presence the way a researcher examines a specimen beneath magnification. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to anchor my mind before it unraveled completely. The silence was absolute. No footsteps of patrolling warriors, no hum of machinery, not even the soft whir of servos. And yet I never felt alone. The scrutiny was constant, pressing into my thoughts with a weight that grew heavier each moment. I tried to focus on memories, my squad mates, the Ridge, Sergeant Callan, but each attempt slipped away like sand through trembling fingers, fading into static at the edges of my consciousness. The chamber was doing it. I could feel my memories thinning, dissolving as if some unseen process were filtering them, extracting fragments that seemed relevant to whatever purpose the Necrons had in mind. When I resisted, when I tried to force my thoughts into focus, the pressure around my skull intensified until I felt a deep, invasive cold slide behind my eyes. The walls responded to my distress. Glyphs reconfigured themselves in tight, swirling spirals that cast reflections like chains made of light, each pulse synchronized with a piercing sensation in my mind. Then the shadows shifted. Something moved at the edge of the chamber, not physically, but in the way the light subtly warped, bending around a presence I could not see. At first it resembled a faint silhouette, humanoid but hollow, composed of refracted light. The figure flickered, growing sharper, until I could make out the faint outline of a face, a human face, pale and strained, eyes wide with terror. My breath caught in my chest as recognition flickered. It was Corporal Harn, one of the troopers who'd fallen near me on the ridge. But Harn was dead. I had seen the Gauss beam tear through him, leaving nothing but a drifting cloud of particles. This could not be him. The apparition hovered at the edge of the room, trembling, its mouth moving silently as though attempting to speak through a barrier. I shut my eyes against it, telling myself it was a hallucination forced on me by whatever process the Necrons were conducting. But when I opened them again, the figure had changed. Now it was Sergeant Callan, armor scorched, hand reaching out the same way it had on the battlefield. His expression was contorted in pain, frozen in the instant before life had fled him. More figures appeared, some familiar, some not, ghostly projections that flickered in and out, each one accompanied by a stabbing ache in my temples. They seemed dredged from my memories, stitched together by an intelligence that did not understand humanity, but sought to replicate it with the precision of a dissected pattern. Slowly, the truth dawned on me. These were not spirits or hallucinations in the true sense. They were echoes, constructs woven from fragments of memory, projected by whatever machine occupied this chamber, each one a test, an experiment, or perhaps a tool. Every apparition felt more invasive than the last, tugging at pieces of my identity, forcing me to confront moments I barely remembered or wished I had forgotten. The projections didn't merely show the dead. They mimicked my own emotions, amplifying fear, sorrow, guilt, then feeding those reactions back into the system as though harvesting them. When I refused to look, the chamber dimmed, and the pressure around me grew crushing, bending my thoughts until I was forced to open my eyes. The walls responded instantly, brightening in ripples of emerald light that carved sharp reflections across the chamber floor. And then, for a moment, everything stilled. The apparitions vanished. The static in my mind receded. The air grew colder, sharper, weighted with expectation. A single figure materialized in the center of the chamber, though not through the flickering distortions that had birthed the echoes. This one stepped forth with the same eerie precision the cryptek had displayed, its outline coalescing from drifting motes of metallic dust that assembled into a tall, skeletal shape. It was a Necron, but unlike the warriors or the cryptek, this construct bore an intricate crown of luminous sigils above its head, each rune orbiting like fragments of a shattered star. It watched me with hollow eyes that glowed faintly, the light shifting with a cadence that felt disturbingly close to breathing. The creature raised one hand, and the chamber's walls responded instantly. The glyphs dimmed, shadows deepened, and a low, resonant hum filled the space. I felt something slip into my consciousness, cold, sharp, analytical. Not a voice, but a presence. And for the first time since my capture, I realized this was no prison in the human sense. It was a surgical theater of the mind, designed to peel apart memory, identity, and will, with a precision nothing living could ever match. The Necron construct tilted its head, and the chamber pulsed with light. Then the presence pressed deeper, touching the memories I had tried so desperately to protect. The last coherent thought I had before the world blurred again was a simple, helpless realization. This was only the beginning of what they intended to do to me. The Vespera strike craft shuddered as it tore through the immaterium, its hull groaning like a wounded beast, while the Geller field flickered with unstable arcs of gold, each spark a tiny war between sanity and the formless predators clawing against the veil, and throughout the ship, a sense of suffocation thickened as though the warp itself were dragging its fingers along every bulkhead. Malachar moved through the dim corridors like a shadow of iron, his cloak trailing faint threads of shimmering ward light. Each rune blazing brighter the deeper the vessel plunged into the psychic depths. And the crew, hardened voidsmen, who'd weathered countless warp transits, could not stop themselves from averting their eyes as he passed, instinctively sensing the storm of power coiled within him, while Arendor, standing on the strategium deck, stared into the roiling void where the viewing ports had long since dimmed under warp turbulence, and beside him Captain Solara, jaw clenched, reported that astropathic interference had increased to nearly catastrophic levels. The ship's choir drowning in a chorus of whispers none could translate, yet all could feel. Whispers that spoke of incomprehensible praise, of ancient oaths resurrected, of names older than any imperial archive dared to remember. And as the ship quaked again, Arendor steadied himself against the railing, sensing that the warp's agitation was no accident but a response, a welcome, directed at him. Though he could not fathom why, for he had never sought the warp, never desired its touch. Yet now it pressed upon him like a starving beast, recognizing a lost fragment of itself. When the alarms flared crimson and the Geller field guttered to half strength, Malachar entered the strategium with the unhurriedness of one accustomed to catastrophe, raising a single obsidian-tipped staff that pulsed faintly with caged light, stabilizing the field for a heartbeat, just long enough for the crew to breathe again, and then he turned to Arendor, eyes burning with a focus sharp enough to carve stone, and said the warp had begun to resonate with him specifically, that his presence alone was distorting the boundaries between reality and madness, and Solara, ever the loyal officer, demanded clarification. But Malachar silenced her with a gesture and explained that somewhere within this immaterial ocean, something ancient was calling to Arendor, something bound to the Emperor long before the Imperium itself, a presence sealed away from time and space, now stirring because the young acolyte's awakening abilities had brushed against its slumber. Arendor wanted to protest, to deny the connection, but a violent surge slammed through the ship before he could speak, sending consoles exploding into sparks, crewmen toppling, and the warp window tearing open with a scream that was not mechanical, but alive. A wail that shook bones and souls alike, and from that fracture a vision erupted, raw and formless, seizing Arendor's mind with talons of molten light, hurling him into a realm without shape, where he glimpsed towering silhouettes locked in battle across a burning sky. A golden figure wreathed in wings of fire, clashing against an abyssal titan crowned with serpents of shadow, and beneath them a world split open as if its very core were screaming, rivers of blood becoming oceans, cities forming into altars, and above it all a voice, neither male nor female, neither human nor god, echoed through him, whispering a word he could not understand, yet instinctively feared, a word that tasted of destiny, ruin, and rebirth. When he snapped back into reality, he was on the deck, lungs burning, Solara kneeling beside him while Malachar stood motionless, analyzing him with the expression of someone who had just witnessed the confirmation of a prophecy long dreaded. And before Arendor could rise, the warp fracture outside the viewing port twisted into a vortex of impossible geometry, birthing shapes that writhed like nightmares sculpted from starlight, their forms shifting between claws, wings, and screaming visages. And the crew opened fire even though they knew the futility of last rounds against entities that existed half in thought and half in hunger. But Malachar raised his staff again and unleashed a shockwave of golden light that obliterated the closest abomination, the ward runes along his arms flaring like miniature suns as he commanded the bridge to divert all power to the Geller field, for if it failed entirely, the warp would swallow them whole. The Vespera reeled as engines howled, and the navigator bled from every orifice, screaming that something in the warp was bending space toward a destination not of their choosing. A gravitational pull not driven by physics, but by will. An ancient will vast enough to rival the gestures of gods, dragging the ship toward a single point in the immaterium where a colossal structure materialized through the chaos, an impossible monolith shaped like an inverted fortress cathedral. Chains of psychic energy anchoring it across dimensions, its spires dripping with golden ichor, its walls carved with symbols that predated any known civilization, and Malachar's composure fractured for the first time as he whispered in disbelief that such a construct should not exist, that it had been erased from all records millennia ago, sealed away when the Emperor still walked among the stars. The ship was pulled closer until the fortress filled the viewport like a staring eye, and Arendor felt that same alien voice rising again inside him, more insistent now, demanding, commanding, recognizing something within him that he did not understand and had never chosen. And as the Vespera collided with the monolith's surface, the ship did not crash but passed through as if into a veil of golden mist, the interior revealing a labyrinth of living metal and chanting echoes, and before anyone could react, the warp storm faded, the ship stabilized, and dead silence swallowed everything. Then, as Arendor rose trembling to his feet, the monolith around them spoke, not with sound, but through every mind aboard, declaring that the one for whom it had waited had finally arrived, and all eyes slowly turned to him, realizing with dawning terror that the warp had not dragged them into a trap, but into a long-planned awakening whose key was Arendor himself. The silence that enveloped the Vespera after its impossible passage into the monolith was so absolute it felt engineered, as though sound itself had been deemed unworthy to exist within these ancient halls. And as the ship's systems flickered weakly back to life, casting trembling beams of pale lumen across the shifting walls, Arendor felt the air tighten around him like a vice, his heartbeat echoing unnaturally loud in the suffocating stillness, while the crew stared wide-eyed and trembling at the cathedral-like labyrinth into which they had been drawn. The surfaces around them pulsed faintly with veins of golden light, like the arteries of a sleeping titan. the architecture shifting subtly when unobserved, rearranging itself according to logic that defied geometry, and Malachar, though visibly shaken, forced himself into motion, muttering fragments of forbidden scripture while his staff vibrated with resonant energy as if reacting to an environment it recognized, and Solara, ever the anchor of rational command, issued orders in a clipped voice that barely concealed the rising dread, instructing the tech priests to assess hull integrity. Yet no sooner had their instruments activated than they shorted out in showers of sparks, overwhelmed by data that exceeded all parameters, as though the monolith itself were rewriting the definitions of matter, energy, and time. Stepping forward, Arendor felt an unseen pressure guiding him, not forceful but inexorable, like fingers of gravity adjusting the trajectory of a falling star. And when he touched the warm metallic floor, a wave of sensation surged through him. Not pain, not power, but recognition, as if the structure were greeting him, welcoming him home from a place he had never been, and he staggered, gripping a railing that bent under his touch like soft clay before hardening again with a pulse of golden luminescence. Malachar immediately reached him, eyes burning with equal parts awe and fear, whispering that the monolith was a psychic construct older than the Imperium, older than recorded human civilization, a citadel built during the Emperor's earliest wars, long before Terra had been unified, and that such a place should not simply exist, for all records of these proto-structures had been purged by the Emperor himself, sealed away under threat of annihilation. Yet here they stood within one, living, breathing, and awakening because of Arendor's presence. Before he could respond, the walls around them trembled with harmonic resonance, and the labyrinth unfolded like a colossal flower, passageways unfurling and closing in rhythmic waves, guiding the ship along a controlled descent until it settled in a massive circular chamber, the floor carved with a sigil so vast and so complex that staring at it made the human mind quiver, the runes shifting between shapes that resembled High Gothic, then Old Earth dialects, then languages no human throat could form, and as the crew gathered with weapons drawn despite knowing it would likely avail them nothing, a column of golden light erupted from the center of the chamber, twisting into a spiral of living radiance that coalesced into a humanoid silhouette 9 feet tall, robed in flowing threads of shimmering energy, its face obscured by a mask of blinding brilliance that flickered with expressions too rapid and layered for mortal senses to decode. Solara raised her pistol reflexively, but the being merely turned its head slightly, and the weapon melted into harmless vapor, the captain recoiling in shock as her hand tingled from the residual heat. And then the being spoke, not with sound, not even with psychic words, but through direct imposition, forming concepts and truths inside every mind at once, revealing itself not as a demon, nor a warp entity in any conventional sense, but as a remnant echo of the Emperor's earliest war scholars, an artificial psyche forged from the Emperor's own will during the Dark Age of strife, designed to safeguard relics of his primordial campaigns, relics too dangerous, too significant, or too unorthodox to remain in human memory. Malachar fell to one knee, overwhelmed by the revelation, while the being, calling itself the Auric Warden, declared that it had slumbered here for tens of thousands of years, awaiting the reawakening of a genetic cipher encoded into a bloodline the Emperor had crafted in secret, a latent lineage that had been scattered across the stars and forgotten even by the Imperium, but destined to reactivate when the galaxy reached the brink of a new cataclysm, and that this lineage, the final contingency, was now stirring inside Arendor. The young acolyte's breath hitched as the warden stepped closer, its presence folding space around it like molten gold bending reality, and Arendor felt his knees weaken as images flooded his mind, visions of the Emperor in his earliest form, striding through a pre-imperial battlefield with a blade of pure thought carving down foes that radiated star-level psychic power, forging alliances with beings of light and war whose names had been stricken from all archives, and binding secrets into bloodlines that had been hidden so deeply even the Primarchs had never known. The visions plunged deeper, showing an ancient pact, a betrayal, a shattering of realms, and a final gambit in which a fragment of the Emperor's own proto-soul, raw, unrefined, but immeasurably potent, had been sealed into a mortal line as a future failsafe, and Arendor realized with dawning horror that he was the living container of that buried fragment, a vessel designed not for glory, but for a last resort ignition, a spark meant to awaken only when the Imperium neared a crisis even the Emperor had foreseen but never spoken of. The Warden, sensing his fear, reached out with a hand of shimmering radiance, and though it did not touch him physically, Arendor felt layers of his mind peeling open like petals, revealing dormant potentials he had never imagined, streams of psychic perception sharpening, his awareness expanding until he could sense the heartbeat of every crew member aboard the ship, the hum of the monolith's energy flow, even faint echoes of distant stars flickering far beyond the immaterium. Solara and Malachar watched in stunned silence as Arendor lifted from the ground, suspended in light, his veins glowing like molten gold, and his eyes fracturing into kaleidoscopic patterns of psychic geometry. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished, dropping him to the floor where he gasped, trembling, the Warden stepping back as though satisfied that the first seal had now been broken. But before anyone could speak, the entire monolith shook, not in hostility, but in alarm, and the Warden's mask flickered with a surge of panic as it declared that something outside, something vast, ancient and ravenous, had detected the activation of the seal and was now converging upon the monolith, a force older than chaos itself, an enemy that the Emperor had sealed away at terrible cost, and which had now awakened to reclaim what Arendor carried within him.